to share with the audience what you think some of the issues about healthy aging, related to healthy aging, that we should remember.
I think what's really important to say that healthy aging is possible, but you need to understand a new definition of healthy aging. It doesn't mean that you won't have any diseases or you won't have any disabilities, but what it really means that you'll be in an environment and you'll have the opportunities to maximize what you do so that you can do what you value. So healthy aging is a new definition. The WHO spent 10 years to sort of reformulate the idea of healthy aging, and it's really a person environment fit. It's the person being able to do what they would like to do. That would be my starting thing, that healthy aging is possible, but it takes everyone to make it that way. It's not just the individual, but it's the individual, their families, the community, society. It really needs to be collective action.
Thank you. Dr. Greenberg, I'd also like to ask you to answer the same question, but in regard to ways of treating Alzheimer-related disease and disorders and related issues.
That's a difficult question to respond to in a fulsome way, because the answer is so broad. The healthy aging issue is exactly the same as what Dr. Ori described. There will be situations where you can still age in a healthy way, but you can have a cognitive disorder. So there are multiple things that are going on at the same time, and one has to decide what to prioritize and then how to prioritize it. I can certainly get into some discussion about recent advances in the Alzheimer therapeutic field, but beyond some symptomatic therapies that appear to work well for short periods of time in individuals who can tolerate them, there's still a long way to go, and there are advances that are being made very rapidly. But healthy aging, regardless of cognitive health, is still a very feasible thing along the lines of what Dr. Ori described.
Mm-hmm. So, with respect to what you mentioned regarding possible therapeutic interventions, could you give us one example?
Would you like to hear what's in the news about aducanumab?
Yes.
Was that what I was being tickled for here?
Yeah.
So one question that I was asked was whether or not I agreed with the FDA decision to approve this drug, and I would rather hold off on the nutshell response to that until the end. I have very little doubt that this is an important drug. Aduhelm is a watershed moment in the history of the Alzheimer's disease research and therapeutic field. But it's important to recognize that it's a start. It's a starting point from which to build. It's not the goal line. The field remains committed to learning what it can from this moment and build on that knowledge to deliver safe, effective, and affordable therapies that will treat and prevent the disease. The key, the important message, the key that will unlock the door to these ultimate achievements is the ongoing willingness from generous and selfless research participants to engage as subjects in investigation. That's very important. They should not be deterred because there is this apparent success, because there is the success is very nuanced. I have little doubt that this drug works in some patients. We just don't know who yet. We do know that there are significant risks to taking the drug that will require regular monitoring. The FDA decision was based on the demonstration that the drug that's been branded as Aduhelm succeeded in removing a pathological hallmark, a biomarker in the brains of subjects who participated in the trial. And I'm going to have a bit more to say on that in a minute. But there's little evidence for any impact on the disease itself. A modest but favorable signal relative to subjects who were on placebo was seen in the high-dose group but with uncustomary statistical analyses, and in only one of the two phase 3 trials that were run, despite the fact that they were identically designed. The FDA's advisory committee and the FDA's own statistician felt that there was insufficient evidence to warrant approval of this drug. So just a few of the nuances of the story, because there's not going to be time to go into. There's been hundreds and hundreds of pages published on this since the June 7th decision to approve. The greatest genetic risk factor for late onset Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form, is the so-called apolipoprotein E gene. This gene exists in 3 forms in humans. The form that has been identified to increase the risk if it is carried in the DNA of the individuals is the so-called E4 allele. So remember E4. Interestingly enough, that risk is greater in women than it is in men. In the Aduhelm trials, the drug response was limited to people who carried this E4 allele. But so were the highest risks, which included edema and microhemorrhages in a significant in the brains, and the significant fraction of those who were treated with the drug. So regular safety monitoring will be required, both for the clinical symptoms of these side effects as well as brain scans. And the rationale for administering the drug to people who lack the E4 gene, which is about half of the people who would qualify for the drug on the basis of their cognitive status, is questionable. The initial approval that was given by the FDA was for Alzheimer's disease, as broad as it can be. In the face of strong reactions to this obvious misstep, that label was changed just a month later to better align with the trial enrollment criteria for mild cognitive impairment or mild or early Alzheimer's disease. However, the thresholds that define these stages were not identified, and no ApoE genotyping is required for access to the drug. Neither are there other important exclusions, such as the use of anticoagulants, which could exacerbate those side effects in the brain, all of which is left to the discretion of the docs to deal with. Next, the demographics of the subjects in the study is problematic. We know that the risk for Alzheimer's disease, including the impact of the E4 allele, the E4 gene, as well as other comorbidities such as vascular issues, heart disease, and diabetes, differ among racial and ethnic groups. Yet almost 80% of the subjects in the trials were white. Less than 1%, in fact, only 11 subjects in the data that went into the approval decision were African American. Less than 8% were Asian, and just 4% were Hispanic or Latino. So what we've really learned from these trials is effects on whites of European ancestry, and yet it's being marketed across all racial groups. So who should actually be exposed to this drug and at what risk? We don't know. The FDA is requiring Biogen to conduct a phase 4 trial to support the approval, the outcome of which could be a reversal of the approval decision. And this is important. But customary regulatory processes would have required a confirmatory trial before approval, and yet despite the fact that the FDA was on record that they would not approve on the basis of a surrogate biomarker without demonstrated clinical effect, they went ahead and did just that. And that was without consulting their advisory committee. Meanwhile, Biogen, the sponsor, has until 2030, 9 years, to complete that phase 4 trial, during which time it can sell the drug at its market price of $56,000 a year. Administration is by monthly infusion, which brings it under Medicare Part B in the US for a large proportion of Alzheimer's patients. That means a 20% copay. 20% of $56,000 is 24% of the median household wealth among older Black adults. So whose homes, savings, and retirements will be overmortgaged because of the desperation for a risky drug with unproven effects? Or who will be unable to afford access when it's a drug that they should perhaps be taking? Also important to understand is that this drug, this is really an important point. It doesn't stop the progression of the disease. It is designed to slow the progression of the disease. How do you measure that in an individual? Patients will still decline while on the drug. When should it be stopped? This too is left up to the prescribing docs. And meanwhile, several major medical centers and the VA have chosen not to administer the drug despite its approval due to unproven clinical effects. And investigations in the approval process are underway both within Congress as well as within the FDA. This is a partial list of the issues. Do we need to know more? Yeah, we do. Does it work? I expect it does in some patients. If we can figure out who, it could be a remarkable success for those individuals. But more research is required, not marketing in the uncontrollable public health environment. So no, I don't agree with the FDA decision, but that's just my opinion. There are 3 similar drugs right behind it. Hopefully that will provide some market pressures, some additional knowledge based on nuances of those clinical trials. To be honest, it's a fascinating time to be a researcher in this field because we're at a place that we never were before. But I'm afraid that we're being too anxious to claim victory before it's time.
Is that the lesson that we should take away from this in terms of our patients?
Yeah, there needs to be patience. There needs to be more research done. We're not at a point yet where we can claim that we have a drug that will either prevent or slow Alzheimer's disease. We don't have the data that have been validated that support that sort of a decision. There's more work to be done.
You mentioned market competition. Is that one?
I'm sorry, you're breaking up.
There seems to be some. Can you hear me now, Dr. Greenberg?
Yes, I can hear you. There's background noise.
You mentioned market competition might promote more data collection and more robust research.
Market, could you hear would market competition actually drive and facilitate the research that you're saying is so desperately needed?
I think it's more than just market competition. When I look at the 3 other similar drugs, and there are other drugs that are dissimilar that have different clinical strategies. When I look at the 3 that are similar, there are differences in the design of those clinical trials. So we will learn something scientifically from the way the outcomes of those trials. What I'm hoping is that the market pressure will reduce the costs so that it's more accessible to patients without strapping them and their well-being financially, and also enable research dollars to flow that will support follow-up trials that aren't going to be too expensive to conduct. Now, if the trial is being run by the sponsor, it's being paid, the drug is being paid for by the sponsor. If the trial is being run as a phase 4, it's not necessarily being paid for by the sponsor. And that's going to be a huge burden to society. From my own point of view, and this is again personal opinion, I do not represent anyone else when I'm saying this. It would have been more reasonable for the drug in the phase 4 trial, or drug period, until final approval was granted, to be at about cost of goods plus a percentage, small percentage, rather than the high price that it is. And I know that there's been some pressure brought to the sponsor to try to reduce that price. I don't know what the status of those discussions is.
Thank you. Let's pivot to another topic about the most effective health behaviors that you think we can ensure that will ensure healthy aging or help to better manage dementia. Do you want to begin, Dr. Ori?
Yes, well, I'd like to sort of make the topic even broader, and that is what are both the behaviors and the lifestyles and the environments that will promote healthy aging and also reduce the risk of dementia. And I think you have to understand first, what are the factors that sort of promote healthy aging and make you less susceptible to diseases such as dementia. So part of it is definitely our genes. And in the past, I think people thought genes were the major issues. We're learning that genes are important, but they're not the major issue. A major factor is probably lifestyles. It's the behaviors, and everybody knows and can point these behaviors out. So there's a difference between knowing and doing, but it's being physically active. It's not smoking. It's not drinking to excess. It's being socially connected, but it's in addition to sort of the behaviors, it's how you think.
Mhm.
And ageism is something that we see, particularly in the field of dementia, where everybody, if somebody's older and can't remember anything, stereotypically you would say that person is demented. So the language has changed from the sort of ageist views. So I think that's really important. But if you hold those negative attitudes about aging, you yourself will be less mentally and physically healthy. In fact, research has shown you actually will die sooner. So, yes, it's the lifestyle behaviors, it's how you think. It's also healthy aging is the environment. How supportive is the environment that you live in? Whether it's the physical environment, whether it's the social environment, there's the whole built environment can make a difference to your health. And I think what's important is it's not just one thing. So when you think about the behaviors, it's not just the smoking, it's not just where you live, it's all of that together.
Mhm. The World Health Organization has designated in my home state, Texas, San Antonio as an age-friendly city. Dr. Eric?
Absolutely. And so age-friendly cities are really recognizing the needs of older people and their needs of their caregivers. So if you think about what leads to independence and what people think when they are no longer able to drive, and that's again with people with cognitive impairment, when they get their driver's license taken away or they no longer have a car, what you need is a city where you'll have transportation. So if you're no longer able to drive, like all Texans thinks, I think it's a Texas born right, you need to have a supportive environment where there would be public transportation, that the environment would be easy to navigate. And part of the environment is also the healthcare environment. With population aging, there's so many more older people, so many more people who have dementia, yet there are far fewer healthcare workers and even geriatricians to take care of you. So I think that's another issue.
Including geriatric primary care physicians as well. What can be done to increase the number of our providers and ancillary providers caring for those at risk for cognitive impairment and who lack these kind of wraparound services?
Okay, let me let Dr. Greenberg jump in, and then I have some ideas too.
I don't have an answer for that question. It's been raised actually, and I don't want to keep dwelling on the aducanumab story, but it's a major challenge that is emerging from the approval of that drug because there aren't enough centers with the range of expertise, which includes geriatric neurologists,
Mhm.
social workers, radiologists, counselors, who will need to be part of a team that will work with the number of subjects who will want to have access to this drug. Now, having said that, the rollout of the drug, the launch has not been what anyone had expected. It's moving much more slowly than had been anticipated, and that's in recent news. But there needs to be an infrastructure so that all of the care can be done in one center, and there aren't that many centers around the country where that's feasible. So there is a shortage. There is an infrastructure issue,
Right. And we're
and that's
talking,
going to be a case with any successful drug that comes down.
so that's certainly the situation with dementia. But going back to the WHO Decade of Healthy Aging, what they really emphasize is the importance of integrated healthcare and affordable, accessible care. So in areas like we do a lot of research in rural Texas, so you may be able to afford the healthcare, but there are no primary care doctors. The other thing I think the way the field is moving is toward team science. So it is a clinician, an MD, it could be a nurse, it's a pharmacist, it's all the people who are helping to diagnose and treat. So I think that's one thing that will help is the recognition that it needs to be a team and not just one person.
There's no INT when it comes to promoting healthy aging and trying to better manage all of these symptoms. I want to turn now actually to Dr. Greenberg and this idea of having a center where it would be one stop where the patients could receive all the services that they need. And last year, as you may recall, there was the first prescription for the Alzheimer's disease blood test. It became available to measure amyloid plaque buildups. Do you think all centers should have this? What are some of the trade-offs, given that this is a non-FDA approved test? How many people may have amyloid, but not dementia or serious cognitive impairment? Can you say a little bit more about your thoughts about what role this should play?
The answer to that one is a little bit easier than the infrastructure issues for the care that would be required. That would, require things like brain scanners and stuff that has to be on site, because these sorts of analyses can be done by a reference lab. So you draw the blood sample, and it can be sent out to be assayed at a central location. Now, in terms of the specific example that you raised, that blood test does not measure amyloid plaque buildup. It provides a soluble level, a soluble measurement, a measurement of soluble amyloid protein levels in the brain. Everyone is at some point or another in their lives has amyloid, but not dementia. Some cognitively advanced individuals die at very old ages, but have been seen to carry boatloads of amyloid in their brain. So amyloid is part of the disease cascade, but it's not the sole cause of cognitive impairment or dementia. The correlation of amyloid with clinical dementia or cognitive impairment is complicated, and we're still trying to figure that out. So the bottom line is, unless there's a concern about cognitive dysfunction first, one is looking at, and one is looking for an underlying cause that may be Alzheimer related. There's really no need to have that test performed. The blood biomarker field is exploding in a dramatically positive way, with a number of novel measures having better predictive value than the amyloid blood test. All still need to be validated against brain pathology and clinical measures to establish numeric values for the blood tests that will be informative for individual patients. This is happening and will likely be available in some shape or form within the next few years. And that will help clinical trial enrollment and also in selecting patients who should be exposed to appropriate drugs at the appropriate time in their disease.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. This is important development, and especially for family members who are trying to take care of their parents as they're growing older and not necessarily being able to recognize the symptoms, knowing how to actually navigate not just some of these new discoveries, but also the information that's provided. It really does take a lot of sort of advanced health literacy. Dr. Ori, would you like to share with us some of your, tips, I guess, for family caregivers and for, adult children who are wrestling with this? I know on a day-to-day basis, I get one or two emails of grown children just absolutely in distress, trying to figure out what to do. And it's not basically steps. Care organizations are trying to make that a little bit easier, but your thoughts?
There are a variety of things that can be done. I think the first thing that's important is to recognize that the bulk of care, whether it's dementia or chronic conditions, is going to be the family. So family caregivers are really the backbone of care. And particularly during the pandemic, they were incredibly stressed out. So what's important is, back to what I said with healthy aging, the burden shouldn't just be on the family, but we need more home and community supports. There are some states that have waivers where they're actually testing out the ability of the government to help people stay at home. If you ask older people and their families what they want to do and where they want to live, they'll say, I want to stay in my own home. I don't want to go to a nursing home. the nursing home cost on average a year is over 90,000. So it's incredibly expensive. It's probably less expensive to have home and community-based care. So you don't want to wait till the caregiver is so stressed out that they can't do anything. The funds in the family have all been depleted, and then the government will end up, that's the only way that the government will pay for long-term care, is once people deplete all the resources. So one is having home and community services. Another is technology. And in the previous discussion, people were talking about all the things that technology can do. Technology can make it so a person who does have cognitive impairment and dementia, who lives alone, and maybe a quarter of people will be living alone, that they can live alone safely. So there'll be sensors in their home that will let you know when patterns of functioning change, when people are sleeping or they're not getting up. So sensors and smart homes, I think, are a way to reduce the burden of care for families. What we do is a lot of evidence-based caregiving programs to have people understand what stressors are and how to deal with stress. So sort of stress busting. But in addition to that, nobody really has taught caregivers how to provide care for both their loved ones who may have dementia or other illness, as well as how to take care of themselves. Because we know that family caregivers are often the hidden patient because they ignore their own health when they're taking care of others. So if we have, primary care docs, when the person comes in, to say, so how are you doing? I know that you must be, spending the 36-hour day, but what are you doing? And make sure that the caregiver themselves are getting preventive care. Those are just a couple of hints.
Yeah, these are very good. Speaking about the role of technology, Dr. Grossman, did you want to, Greenberg, would you like to add to that any ideas or examples that you can share with us on what might help family caregivers or others?
Yeah, there are sensors that can be passive sensors in the homes that not only establish patterns but also make measurements of signs of cognitive decline or cognitive status, I should say. There's a wonderful program that was begun and has built out of the University of Oregon Health Sciences Center. It's a company that was started there called Orca, where they have smart homes, and what they're seeing with particular aspects of what can be monitored passively in the home and with computer usage. The number of uses and types of use of a mouse could potentially reduce the number of subjects required for a clinical trial by an order of magnitude. And as anyone who's on the line who knows what the major hurdle is in a clinical trial is recruiting and enrolling. That's the largest time sink and one of the largest expenses of being able to do a clinical trial, or even an observational trial. So there are a lot of benefits that could be achieved that way. Another one that really impressed me the first time I went to a technology meeting several years ago, and I think it's an exemplar of what can be achieved, is the ability of technology to reduce stress between the caregiver and the patient. Stress is a number one issue, a primary issue in those situations. And one of the problems that was exemplified was getting dressed, where the patient is trying to get dressed and just isn't getting it. And it has to repeat it over and over and over again. And the caregiver who was directing the patient through that process was getting increasingly frustrated. If the caregiver can leave the room and there's a robotic thing that can interact with the patient with unlimited patience, guide that individual through getting dressed or through hygiene in the bathroom, that reduces a major source of stress, so that the caregiver and the person that he or she is caring for can spend their time sitting together and doing things that are more relaxing and enjoyable to them than those basic repetitious things.
Japan, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to add something about technology. I think there's this, again, stereotypic image that older people are technophobic, that they don't like technology, that they would rather have touch. And so I think we've seen during the pandemic that when it was very difficult to be connected with your loved ones, your grandchildren, your, adult children, that technology played a huge role in keeping people socially engaged. A lot of people got on the bandwagon fast, but for those who didn't, the Aging Services Network actually, would help train people, help them get over that sort of, I've never used an iPad. So I think one of the things we're going to see in 2022 and the future is that older people will be more tech savvy. They won't be so afraid because they've learned that if you want to be looking at your grandchildren, you may not be able to hug them, but you can see the picture that they drew for you that day. So technology is not a panacea. It's not going to solve everything, but it certainly has a place with all of these other things that help promote healthy aging.
Yes, we have this sort of new world of caregiving and in terms of who's involved. I want to sort of elaborate on this and hear your thoughts on the role of neighbors in communities. Dr. Warren?
It is so important. I mean, particularly for the older adults and particularly older women who live alone. There are all kinds of things that can be done. Meals on Wheels don't just deliver food, but they deliver social connection. They check to make sure people are okay. There are certainly retirement communities and places where it's your neighbor that's your new family. And what they would call it is a fictive family. It's not blood, but it's people who care about you and want to help you and stay connected.
Yeah, it's sort of when strangers are becoming family as we're getting older, and it's becoming even more important as we look at these migration trends and the extent of based on the census data. And it also brings up another issue regarding grandchildren, because we're seeing many older parents now, multiple generations, given extended life expectancy, where grandchildren are taking over that responsibility.
And I think what's really important is another sort of stereotype that older people are just on the receiving end. But in reality, grandparents are now caring more and more custodially for children. If you think about the recent crises in America, the opioid crises, or now the COVID pandemic, where people are dying. And so you need to have everyone in the family able to step up. And in some cases, it's grandparents getting care. In other cases, it's providing and giving care.
And in terms of other institutional arrangements, intergenerational day centers now are emerging as a national trend as well.
Exactly. Or these kind of assisted living places where you have a school right next door so that you have that interaction between young and old. We shouldn't have an age segregated society. And I think that's the way we've traditionally thought. You're young, you go to school, you get married, partner up, you work, you retire, and then you really have 20 years off in between retirement and death. But I think we should shake up society. And so what we need is to think about lifelong learning. You often hear the rare event of somebody 80 finally going back and going to college. Or I think another thing that would help healthy aging is having the infrastructure for people to be able to stay in the workplace if they would like to be able to accommodate. Because if people are living about 20 years between retirement age 60 and then average life expectancy 80, what are they going to do with those 20 years? Healthy aging really says you need to have meaningful roles your whole life.
Dr. Greenberg, would you like to add to other perspectives on how to better manage our behaviors in healthy aging, but also for those patients who have been diagnosed, how they can best manage their symptoms?
I think Dr. Ori has really covered it pretty well. Healthy aging, it needs to be kept in mind that the brain is the most vascularized organ in the body. So anything which is good for your cardio system is going to be good for your brain. And that means, cardiopulmonary exercise, walking. Doesn't have to be, you don't necessarily have to be an athlete. You can just, walk a certain amount at a brisk pace every day or 3 to 5 times a week. Social engagement does that. Music, playing music, doing art, things that get the brain not only functioning, but also increases blood flow. These are all good. None of it is going to be necessarily a cure into the sum of things that will have a positive effect, and healthy diet has to do with that as well. And of course, I'm do as I say, not as I do here. But I do want to mention one thing. I got into the field 30 years ago because of my grandmother, who I witnessed dying of Alzheimer's disease. 3 years before she died of Alzheimer's disease, Dr. Ori, she earned an Associate of Arts degree at Touro College in New York. So you're absolutely,
lifelong learning.
Exactly.
That's so important. I guess what I'd like to add specific to dementia, the Texas Alzheimer's Research Care Consortium has funded us for an innovation, which is really a smartwatch, which is both a locator so that you know where the person's going, so it helps with wandering, but it also helps with connectedness because it has a walkie-talkie. So imagine you're with your mom and you're in the store and you get separated and you just sort of, look at your Captain watch and you say, "Hey, Mom, can you tell me where you are?" And she'll say, "I'm over here by the lettuce." And you say to her, "I'll come get you." So again, it keeps the person with dementia who's lost from really being upset, and it helps you as the caregiver find that person and have them be safe. So I think these are the technologies that you're working on that basically figure out what the symptomatology may be, both for the person with cognitive impairment as well as the stressor on the caregiver, and you work both ways and you help both at the same time.
It's actually very difficult in many ways to be able to sort of observe these behaviors when one is a distant caregiver. I remember my mother-in-law was very socially competent, but we were distant caregivers, and didn't realize how much she had declined in terms of her cognitive function. She was driving and doing what she needed to do. And I think this will be a new challenge to have others involved in the network to be able to sort of support those technologies, because we know now that we have Zoom and all of these other platforms that make that possible, but not until you can really better understand what some of those implications are.
Right. I think what's also important, I want to reiterate something that Dr. Greenberg said early on. Aging is nuanced. And so I think whether it's a drug or a technology, you have to sort of have the end user in mind, whether it's the person, patient, family. And it's not one intervention, one drug that's going to help everybody in the same way. And so I think in the same way that risk factors play together and you don't know exactly for an individual, you want to do the best interventions you can, but you have to recognize that they need to be tailored toward individuals, populations, settings.
Yeah, personalized. Yeah, go ahead, Dr.
I'd like to agree with that very enthusiastically. We don't have drugs right now that we can hang our hat on.
Yeah.
Lifestyle modifications that in combination actually have a better effect than any of the drugs that have been developed. And I was once joking with at an Alzheimer's research summit.
Mm.
A group that I was involved with in Toronto had shown that lifelong bilingualism at a population statistical level prolonged or delayed the onset of Alzheimer's disease by 5 years. And I looked at a group of my ex-pharma colleagues and said, "You'd love to put that in a pill, wouldn't you?" The lifestyle modifications should be personalized to the same degree that a pharmacologic modification intervention should be. And we also should be looking at combinations. And I'm not talking about combinations of drugs alone, but combinations perhaps of a drug and a lifestyle. So, for example, you needed to have a certain measure of cardiovascular health in order for a pharmacologic treatment to work. And we have to be open to these sorts of concepts as we develop the intervention field. I don't want to say drug discovery field, the intervention discovery field, which should cover all of these aspects that make up what we are.
I absolutely agree. And then even if we had something that worked with the majority of people, just what you said about drugs, it's not tested in the populations. So people who are lower income or from racial ethnic minorities or rural or whatever, often the interventions haven't been tested in these populations. So whether it's the receptivity or the actual implementation or the effectiveness, we don't know yet in many cases.
That's right.
Well, this brings up the whole issue of how the pandemic has affected healthy aging and getting vaccinated, and some of the ethnic differences in those rates and concerns about this and fear and misinformation, which has sort of hampered some of these efforts in achieving herd immunity, but also what is it going to take when we look at different groups for healthy aging? Could you elaborate a little bit on that, Dr. Lori?
Okay, well, we know a couple of things. The pandemic has certainly been most devastating for older people. The good news is older people are the ones that are most likely to be vaccinated, but they are still getting breakthrough cases, and that's bad. But in terms of the health impacts of the pandemic, the mental health, certainly anxiety and depression has increased with everyone during the pandemic. But what's really surprising is it's the younger groups, it's the 18 to 24-year-olds, when they do all of these national surveys, they're the ones that aren't doing as well. And older adults are still nervous and anxious and unhappy that they're not able to see their loved ones. But older adults are incredibly resilient. And that is, they've had a lifetime to cope with adversity. So when another adversity comes up, they have some resources within, and they have the knowledge that this too will pass. The time horizon is also different. They're looking at what they can do for every day that they live, once they're 80 or 90, to make it meaningful. They're not 18 and saying, "Oh, I can't go out and meet my friends and go to the concert." So the needs and the perspectives are different.
Dr. Greenberg, did you have any thoughts about how the pandemic, affects treatment of your patients and those who, within the network, dealing with healthy aging, dementia, just to follow social isolation?
The social isolation aspect is devastating for someone who has a cognitive difficulty. Isolation is one of the worst things that can happen. The pandemic, while it's had that impact on individual cases, has also created opportunities that were unimaginable before. it began. So there's been a remarkable push and developments on the part of the clinical Alzheimer research field, the Alzheimer Center Network, on developing cognitive batteries that can be administered remotely, and validating those batteries so that the data that come back are actually informative. Clinical assessments can be done, unless, of course, they are the assessments that involve the taking of bodily fluids, a blood draw or cerebrospinal fluid. So there have been, and this was part of the previous discussion before we came on as a panel on healthcare moving into the home. And not only does it move into the home, it creates opportunities for accessibility in parts of the country that wouldn't have contact with a specialist. They would only have contact, and maybe not even close contact, geographically with a primary care physician. This now becomes much more accessible as a primary step towards identifying someone who may actually need to be moved into a more significant follow-up treatment, and may ultimately be may ultimately increase effectiveness and decrease costs. What did stop, of course, were autopsies. And there's people who are maybe squeamish about the topic, shouldn't be, but those create aerosols, and there had to be a development of a technology where this could be done safely in the event that the subject had the virus. And guess what? It happened. So there have been research advances. There have been advances that deliver services to individuals and their caregivers. So if there's an upside to the pandemic, and I don't want to imply at all that I would trade it for this, because the loss of life and the suffering has been devastating, and I'm actually going to a mass and celebration of life for a friend who died of COVID.
But I would say, let me just jump in. I'd say the same thing about population aging. People think about it in doom and gloom terms, but it's given us an opportunity, and it's challenged us to understand better the needs of older people and their families, and to recreate, whether it's policies or programs, services, or systems. So I think you're right, Dr. Greenberg, that every challenge, you shouldn't just dwell on the challenge, but you should see the opportunity that it might also create.
Well, many patients want to benefit, and their family members want to help them get access to these services. Just returning to this point, and what are some of those institutions that can be tapped into to learn more?
Every single institution in America, if you think about it, aging is everybody's business. So the solution has to be, everybody's doing it. Dr. Engel, that we basically age from conception to death, right? So it should be every institution. It's not just healthcare. It's not just the aging services sector, but it's banking, it's real estate. Every single institution needs to recognize by the end of the decade, there are going to be more older people than children in America, and that everybody needs to think about the problem not as a problem, but a solution to be found.
Right. Caregiver crisis is emerging because of our changes in our population structure. Good point. So with the time we have remaining, I'd like to have you share with us your wish list to improve healthy aging, but also improve our research and any other wishes that you may have for all of us.
So my wish is that we do what many aging organizations are saying, that we reframe aging. So we reframe the idea about what aging means, the way that we interact with older people, that we start having a positive or a realistic view, and that we recognize it's your last question, that it's everyone's responsibility. So it's not just the geriatrician, it's just not the home health nurse, but it's everyone working toward collective action. That would be my wish.
Okay. Dr. Greenberg? What's on your wish list?
It depends upon the category you're asking. If it's the human side, it would be that we become more accepting and supportive of each other, and less partisan in all of our interactions, because that's going to reduce stress and it's going to build community, and that's going to be beneficial to healthy aging. In terms of the science, we need to open up our thinking more than we have been, and getting back to, and I don't like to be pegged as an Alzheimer guy, someone who's involved with neurodegenerative diseases of aging. Most clinical trials, we have to recognize, show any signal of treatment effect are comprised of responders and non-responders. We average all of the data, and we pool all of those people together. But together, the data, they contribute to these average effects, which analyzes outcomes, and we need to deconstruct those in order to understand who responded and how well, and through post hoc retrospective analyses, create testable hypotheses for follow-up trials. Well, that's another problem that I just defined, because the patent life of the drugs is limited. So who's going to pay for those follow-up trials, and who's going to profit? Business as usual is not conducive to doing the science in the most rational way, and we have to figure out how to fix that. There was a we need to also stop deceiving ourselves that there's going to be a one-size-fits-all drug because of the heterogeneity of this disorder. So personalized medicine approaches, which have been developed for cancer, by the way, and we have better tools than they did when they were starting to do this in the 80s. For treating a definable subgroup of subjects will be a profound advancement that will lead to rapid further advances. And the same can be said both for pharmaceutical drugs as well as lifestyle modifications and combinations of them, as I was saying before. And again, if we could come up with the pharmaceutical companies, and I was in that field for a very long time, and I understand what drives the business model. And there is a desire to get a broad label so that you can sell your drug to as many people as possible. But if we could come up with a drug, the grand we, that treated a definable subset of Alzheimer's subjects, 5 to 10%, and we could then predict these people are going to respond to that drug, and we could then begin to understand why and build out from there. But just 5 to 10% of Alzheimer's subjects, you know what that number is equivalent to? It's equivalent to every person who has Parkinson's disease in the country. So that little fraction is a blockbuster. It's profound, and it would be an intellectual, a blockbuster of intellectual understanding as well. So these are some of my wishes, and there are some major advances that are being made. So, for example, it was in the news in the past month that repurposed diuretic, bumetanide, was identified as a potential treatment for Alzheimer's disease. It was a tour de force publication, a study that combined state-of-the-art gene expression analyses, stem cell biology, autopsy studies on patients, database mining, and epidemiology. Talk about bringing together expertise, a range of expertise, to identify a repurposed drug that's ready now because of that study for both basic research and for clinical trials in Alzheimer's subjects. And it's the development of these new technologies, and we're very much involved in trying to do that in the Translational Center at Hopkins, and doing so in a rational way, in ways that hadn't been done before, utilizing assets that are uniquely valuable to develop these new ways of thinking to come up with successes that wouldn't otherwise be possible. And it doesn't have to be a new chemical entity. It could be a drug that's sitting on the shelf for another indication that just needs to be restudied in a different context. Where's the profit going to be in that? That's above my pay grade. The profit that we should be focusing on is the profit of helping the patients and their caregivers.
Thank you. And the whole issue of healthcare financing is definitely something we need to give serious attention to. With the time remaining, I just wanted to ask you for any final thoughts. Dory?
I would say, on one hand, we talk about longevity and the actual average life expectancy is going down. So let's not focus on the number of years we're living, but really health span, that quality of life. And so I think that's why people are so concerned with the dementia drugs, because they want quality of life to remain high. And I think that's really important. It's just not how long you're going to live, but what you do with those years you do live.
Thank you. And Dr. Greenberg, anything else?
Dementia drug isn't necessarily going to improve your quality of life. Improving your quality of life would be preventing the onset of dementia. And that's where hopefully the drugs will come in and have an impact. That's where lifestyle modifications will have an impact. That's where relationships will have an impact.
Okay, thank you so much. This has been so informative. I'm Jacqueline from UT Austin, OBJ School of Public Affairs. Again, I want to thank you, Dr. Greenberg and Dr. Ori.
Thank you.
It's our pleasure. Thank you so much.